Just a few yards of cheap fabric, Mum. My daughter-in-law said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. Then she held up the quilt I'd spent 4 months making, every stitch by hand, and dropped it into the recycling bin by the caterer's station like it was a paper napkin. My son didn't say a word. I sat there in my good dress from Sears, the one I'd worn to his college graduation, and I watched the woman he married wipe her hands together like she'd just touched something dirty. Her mother, seated beside her, laughed into her champagne flute, a soft, private laugh, the kind that's designed to be heard. I stood up, quietly picked up my handbag, walked to the recycling bin, reached past the paper plates and empty cups and pulled my quilt back out, folded it the way my mother taught me, corner to corner, smooth. Then I left the rehearsal dinner without saying goodbye to anyone. That night, I drove back to my house in Cloverdale and sat at my kitchen table with the quilt in my lap and the overhead light buzzing the way it had for 30 years. I didn't cry. I've never been much of a crier. I'm Evelyn. I'm 63 years old. I've been sewing since I was 9, running a small alterations shop since I was 31, and apparently, in the eyes of my son's new family, I am just the woman who hems pants for a living. What they didn't know about me could fill a filing cabinet. Actually, it filled 3. I got up from the table and walked to the back bedroom, the one I used as a sewing room. Along the far wall, behind the rack of unfinished alterations, was a door that most people assumed was a closet. It led to a small office I'd built myself in 1998, back when I was renovating the house and decided I needed one place in the world that was entirely mine. Inside, 3 steel filing cabinets, a fireproof safe, a laptop I kept offline, and on the desk, a framed photograph of my late husband, Arthur, taken the year before he died. He was standing in front of the first commercial building we'd ever purchased together, a small strip mall in Decatur, Georgia. We'd paid cash. Neither of us told anyone. Arthur died in 2011. The properties kept growing. By the time my son Garrett married Serena Whitfield at the Aldercroft estate last spring, I owned 14 commercial properties across 3 states and a residential portfolio that my accountant estimated at slightly over $4 million. Garrett knew I was comfortable. He did not know the full picture because I'd never shown it to him. I'd wanted him to build his own life on his own terms, the same way Arthur and I had. I'd been waiting for the right moment. That night, after the rehearsal dinner, sitting in my office with Arthur's photograph, watching me from the desk, I understood that the right moment had already come and gone. My son had chosen to say nothing while his wife threw away 4 months of my work. That told me everything I needed to know about the household I was about to watch him enter. I pulled out the folder labeled Aldercroft and opened it on the desk. Because here's what Serena didn't know when she laughed into her champagne. Here's what her mother, Vivian Whitfield, didn't know when she made that soft, designed-to-be-heard sound. Here's what my son didn't know when he stared at his plate and said nothing. The Aldercroft estate, the venue they'd chosen for the wedding, the venue Serena had talked about for 2 years because it was the most prestigious event space in the county, belonged to me. I purchased it in 2017 through my holding company, Cloverdale Properties LLC, paid $2.3 million in a private sale when the previous owners ran out of operating capital. I'd kept Philip, their venue manager, on staff and let him run the day-to-day. I didn't advertise my ownership. There was no reason to. Serena had booked it herself. She'd filled out the application, toured the grounds with her mother, chosen the ballroom and the rose garden and the outdoor terrace. She had no idea she was booking a party on my property. I closed the folder and made myself a cup of tea. Tomorrow was the wedding. I would go. I would sit in the 3rd row with a corsage I'd made myself, and I would watch my son get married. And I would say nothing. Not yet. But I had started thinking about what came next. The wedding was beautiful, if you like that sort of thing. 200 guests, white flowers everywhere. A string quartet playing something I recognized but couldn't name. Serena looked genuinely lovely in her dress. I'll give her that. My son looked happy in the way young men look happy when they don't yet understand the shape of the life they're choosing. I sat in the 3rd row and watched and thought about the quilt folded in the trunk of my car. At the reception, Garrett found me near the buffet. "Mom." He hugged me and I let him. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn since college. I'm really glad you're here. Of course I'm here. You're my son. He shifted his weight. He had something to say and he was deciding how to say it. I waited. About last night, Serena. She's under a lot of stress. The rehearsal, the seating chart, everything. She didn't mean it the way it came out. She dropped my quilt in the recycling bin, Garrett. I know. He looked at his shoes. I should have said something. I'm sorry. It was a real apology, or close to one. I put my hand on his arm. Go be with your wife. We'll talk later. He nodded, relieved in the way people are relieved when a hard thing turns out to be shorter than expected. He went back to Serena. I watched his mother-in-law, Vivienne, touch his arm in that proprietary way that told me she'd already decided where he ranked in her family's hierarchy. I ate my dinner. I drove home. I took the quilt out of the trunk and put it back in my sewing room. Then I called my accountant. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Decatur when my property manager, Philip, called. Mrs. Evelyn, he said. He'd been calling me that for 7 years, and I'd stopped correcting him. I've been meaning to mention something. There was a man here last week asking about the Aldercroft, said he was a potential investor, wanted to know about the ownership structure. What was his name? He gave me a card. Conrad Whitfield. I set down my coffee. Conrad Whitfield was Serena's brother. He was 34, worked in commercial real estate in Atlanta, and had been, according to a 3-minute search on my phone, recently associated with a development group called Whitfield Crane Partners. What did you tell him? That ownership was private, and he'd need to submit a formal inquiry in writing. Philip paused. He seemed to already know quite a bit about the property, kept mentioning the 2017 purchase price. I thanked him and hung up. I sat with my coffee for a moment, watching the street outside. A woman walked by with a double stroller. A man in a postal uniform stopped to check his route sheet. The Whitfield family was doing research on a property they didn't know belonged to their daughter's new mother-in-law. That was interesting. The question was, why? I called my attorney, Frank DeLuca, the same man who'd handled my real estate transactions for 15 years. I need you to pull everything you can find on Whitfield Crane Partners, I told him. Quietly. How quietly? The kind of quiet where nobody knows you're looking. Frank called me back 4 days later. Evelyn, he said, and his voice had that particular tone he used when he had something to tell me that he didn't enjoy telling me. You're not going to like this. Whitfield Crane Partners had been acquiring properties adjacent to the Aldercroft for the past 18 months. 3 parcels total, purchased through shell companies at above-market prices. The pattern, Frank said, was consistent with someone positioning to force a sale or acquisition of the anchor property, in this case the Aldercroft itself. They're trying to box you in, Frank said. If they own everything around you and you're the last holdout, they can make your property difficult to access, difficult to operate. Then they make an offer when your revenue drops. And if I don't sell, then they keep squeezing. It's a standard play. Unpleasant, but legal. I was quiet for a moment. The man running the partnership, I said. Has he done this before? 3 times in the past 5 years, according to county records. 2 sellers took the offers. 1 went to litigation and eventually sold at a loss. I thanked Frank and told him I'd be in touch. That evening, I drove to Garrett and Serena's apartment. A nice building in Buckhead. The Whitfields had helped with the deposit, which Garrett had mentioned in passing the previous Christmas, in a way that suggested I was supposed to be impressed. I rang the bell. Serena answered, still in her work clothes. Her face did the thing faces do when you open a door and find someone you weren't expecting and weren't entirely glad to see. Evelyn, hi, Garrett's not home yet. I know, I came to talk to you. She opened the door wider and let me in. The apartment was decorated in that very precise way that means someone spent a lot of time and money making it look effortless. I sat on their couch and put my handbag on my lap. Your brother Conrad has been asking questions about the Aldercroft estate, I said. Serena's expression shifted. Just slightly, but I've been watching people's faces for 63 years. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Whitfield Crane Partners. 3 adjacent parcels. 18 months of positioning. The color changed in her face. Not guilt. Something more complex. the look of someone who has been caught but hasn't yet decided how to respond. That's a business matter, she said carefully. My brother runs his own company. I'm not involved in his investments. Were you aware that your brother was investigating the ownership of the property where you held your wedding reception? A long pause. Conrad mentioned it once, she said. He said he thought it might be a good acquisition target. I didn't ask for details. But you knew. She met my eyes. I knew he was interested in it. I didn't know the details of his strategy. A beat. It's a valuable property, Evelyn. Anyone in commercial real estate would be interested. I'm sure they would, I said. I stood up and picked up my handbag. I want you to know that I'm aware of what your family is doing, and I want you to tell your brother Conrad that his research is incomplete. I walked to the door. Serena followed, not speaking. There's something else, I said. I turned back to face her. The quilt I made for you, 4 months of work. I'd like to know if you still have it. Something moved across her face, maybe shame, maybe just calculation. I'll look for it. Don't bother, I said. I made you something I thought you deserved. I was wrong about that. We'll see if I'm wrong about other things. I drove home. I called Frank from the kitchen table. I want to put the Aldercroft on the market, I told him. Not to Whitfield Crane, to a non-profit housing developer I've been in contact with. Frank was quiet for a second. You've been planning this? I've been considering it for 2 years. This makes the decision easier. The non-profit was called Hartwell Community Housing. I'd met their executive director, a woman named June, at a Chamber of Commerce event in 2022. They built mixed-income residential developments on commercial properties, specifically targeting service workers, teachers, hospital aides, sanitation employees, people who kept cities running and couldn't afford to live in them. I've been quietly in conversation with June for 18 months. The Aldercroft, with its acreage and its existing structure, could become 72 units of permanent, affordable housing. What about the Whitfields? Frank asked. They can keep their 3 parcels. Without the Aldercroft as the anchor, their acquisition strategy doesn't work. They'll have overpaid for land they can't develop the way they planned. That's going to create some family tension. Yes, I said, it probably will. I want to tell you what happened the morning the sale papers were finalized. It was a Tuesday in October, 8 months after Serena dropped my quilt in that recycling bin. I sat in Frank's office in a chair I'd sat in for 15 years and signed my name to a transfer that would convert the most prestigious event venue in the county into homes for 72 families. The number on the sale was $2.8 million above what I'd paid, minus what I'd taken in revenue over 7 years. Structured as a below-market transfer to Hartwell Community Housing, with a portion going directly into a renovation fund. Frank passed me the pen, and I signed. That same afternoon, Garrett called. Mom. His voice was flat. I need to talk to you. I know. Conrad told us. About the Aldercroft. About you owning it. I waited. He said you sold it out from under us, that you did it on purpose to hurt Serena's family. Conrad's family spent 18 months positioning to force me into a distressed sale, I said. I sold the property to a non-profit housing developer. 72 families are going to have homes because of that transaction. I'd like you to tell me what I did that was wrong. Silence on his end. You never told me you owned it, Garrett said. You never told me anything. You came to my wedding and sat in the 3rd row and never said a word. No, I didn't. Why? I looked out the kitchen window at my backyard, the same backyard where I'd taught Garrett to ride his bike, where Arthur had built the garden beds that I still planted every spring. Because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become, I said. Not what kind of man you'd become around my money. He was quiet for a long time. She threw away your quilt, he said finally. Yes, she did. Another silence, the kind that has weight to it. I should have said something. You should have. I'm sorry, Mom. His voice cracked on the last word. Not the polished, relieved apology from the wedding reception. Something rawer. I'm really sorry. I know you are. What do I do now? That depends on what you decide matters. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing. Conrad is furious, he said. Serena says her family is talking about legal options. Frank said there aren't any, but they're talking. Let them talk. She's my wife, Mom. I know she is. I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to be honest about what you saw that night and what you chose to do about it. The line was quiet again. Can I come over? He asked. On Sunday. I'll make dinner, I said. He came alone. I made pot roast the way I'd been making it since before he was born, the one he used to request every birthday. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in as a boy doing homework while I cooked. We didn't talk about the Aldercroft. We didn't talk about Conrad or Vivienne or Whitfield Crane Partners. We talked about Arthur, about the early years, about the strip mall in Decatur and the second property and the third, about what it feels like to build something slowly and quietly until the day you look around and realize it became substantial while no one was watching. After dinner, I got up and went to the sewing room, came back with the quilt. I set it on the table between us. I made this for your house, I said. Not for Serena to keep or throw away. For your house, for the home you're building, if you want it. He touched the edge of it, traced one of the patterns, a hexagon I'd cut from a shirt of Arthur's that had worn through at the elbows. Is that Dad's shirt? One of them? He sat with that for a moment. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me. Just be someone worth making things for. Garrett picked up the quilt and held it. He's 40 years old and he held that quilt like he was 10. I let him. 6 months later, I stood at the groundbreaking for what would become Aldercroft Commons. June stood at the podium talking about median income and housing burden percentages. The city council member gave a speech. A local news crew filmed the whole thing. I stood at the back of the crowd in a hard hat that was slightly too big for my head and watched them turn the first soil in what used to be the parking lot of the most prestigious event venue in the county. A woman standing next to me introduced herself. Her name was Anna Reyes. She was a hospital aide at Grady Memorial, worked overnight shifts, had been on Hartwell's waiting list for 2 years. She'd just been approved for a unit. I heard you donated the property, she said. She wasn't quite looking at me, just kind of watching the ceremony. My daughter, she asked me if we were really going to have our own place. I didn't know what to tell her. I kept waiting for it to fall through. It's not going to fall through, I said. She glanced at me then. You're really the one who donated it. I sold it at a reduced rate. June and her team did the real work. Anna was quiet for a second. Then she said, why? I looked at the turned earth, at the stakes in the ground marking where the foundation would go. I thought about a strip mall indicator and a man standing in front of it with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face like he'd gotten away with something wonderful. Because buildings should be for the people who need them, I said, not for the people who already have enough. She nodded slowly. I don't think she had anything else to say, and neither did I, so we stood there and watched the rest of the ceremony together. Garrett came to the groundbreaking. He was standing on the other side of the crowd with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching. He'd come alone. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. After the ceremony, as people were filtering out, he found me near the temporary construction fence. It's a good thing you did, he said. Arthur would have done the same. Yeah. He looked at the churned-up ground. He really would have. We walked to the parking lot together. At the edge of it, he stopped. Serena and I are in counseling, he said. We've been going for about 6 weeks. I nodded. It's hard. There's a lot to work through. He looked at me. She knows she was wrong. About the quilt, she told me that. I don't know if she'll tell you. She doesn't have to tell me anything. Mum. He put his hand on my arm. I need you to know I see it now. All of it. The shop, the properties. The way you kept showing up and doing the work and never made it about the money. He stopped. I think I spent a long time being embarrassed by the wrong things. Most people do, I said. The lucky ones figure it out. He hugged me before he got in his car. A real hug, the kind that means something. I drove home to Cloverdale, made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table where I'd been sitting since 1989, under the light that still buzzed. On the wall above the table, I'd hung the quilt, not the one I'd made for Garrett. That one was in his house now. I'd seen a photo he sent me of it, folded over the back of the couch. This one was older. The first quilt I ever made, Started the winter, I was 9 years old, and finished the following spring. Squares cut from my father's old work shirts and my mother's house dresses. My daughter-in-law had dropped my work in a recycling bin and called it cheap fabric. She hadn't understood what she was looking at. That wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was just a failure of seeing. The trick to sewing, the thing my mother taught me before anything else, is that you have to understand the grain of the fabric before you cut. You have to know which direction the threads run, or the whole thing pulls apart at the seams. It's a kind of patience that looks like stillness from the outside, but it isn't stillness. It's attention. I'd been paying attention my whole life. People just hadn't noticed. Anna Reyes moved into Aldercroft Commons 14 months after the groundbreaking. On her first night there, she sent me a photograph through June's office. Her daughter was standing in the doorway of their apartment, laughing at something outside the frame. I printed it and put it on my desk, next to the photograph of Arthur. Everything I built for moments like that one. The strip mall and the commercial properties and the late nights in the office and the 30 years of hemming and altering and listening to people talk while I worked. All of it pointing toward a woman, laughing in a doorway because she finally had a place to stand. My son calls me every Sunday now. Sometimes we just talk about whatever. Last week he told me Serena is learning to sew. She signed up for a beginner's class at the community center. He said she made a pillowcase and was frustrated because her seams weren't straight. I told him to tell her that's how it starts. Nothing is straight at the beginning. You just keep working until your hands understand what your eyes are trying to do. He said he'd pass it along. I went back to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and started cutting fabric for the quilt I was making for whenever they have a child. Because you don't wait to start something like that until you need it. You start early. You work slowly. You make something that will last. That's always been the whole point. The quilt is hanging on my kitchen wall right now. I can see it from where I'm sitting. 4 months of work. Hexagons cut from Arthur's old shirts, the ones that had worn through at the elbows because he wore them until they had nothing left to give. I made something out of what most people would have thrown away. That's been the pattern of my whole life, if I'm honest. Taking what others dismissed and building something lasting from it. When Serena dropped it in that recycling bin, she wasn't just discarding fabric. She was making a judgment about what kind of person I was. A seamstress, someone who hems pants for a living, someone whose gifts don't count because they don't come in the right kind of box. What she didn't understand, what took me 63 years to understand myself, is that how you treat someone's effort tells you everything about your own character and nothing at all about theirs. I've thought about that a lot since everything came out into the open, about cause and effect, about how the choices we make quietly, when we think no one is paying attention, are actually the ones that determine everything. Serena's family had been positioning against my property for 18 months. They were patient and methodical, and they thought they were invisible. Conrad probably never imagined that the woman whose quilt his sister threw away was the same woman who owned the land he was trying to acquire. That gap between what they assumed and what was actually true, that gap was built entirely out of their own judgment. They decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. That decision cost them. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. I don't feel like I won something. That's not quite the right word for what happened. What I feel is something closer to clarity. For a long time, I kept my life very private because I wanted Garrett to develop his own sense of what mattered without my finances shaping his choices. That was a reasonable intention, but I held back so much that there was space for him to drift toward people who filled it with a different set of values. I contributed to that, and I have to be honest with myself about it. The thing that saved us, Garrett and me, wasn't the property reveal or Conrad's plan collapsing. It was a Sunday pot roast and a quilt on a kitchen table. It was my son touching the edge of a fabric hexagon and recognizing his father's shirt. Character isn't built in the dramatic moments. It's built in the ordinary ones, the ones you practice so many times they become who you are. Garrett is 40 years old and he's still learning what he values. So is Serena, I think. Learning is slow and it isn't linear, and it requires a certain kind of stubbornness. The willingness to look at yourself clearly and keep going anyway, even when what you see is uncomfortable. I have spent my whole life practicing that. The early mornings, the night alterations, the properties acquired one at a time over 30 years. None of that came from talent. It came from showing up with a clear head and doing the next honest thing over and over. until the small choices accumulated into something I could stand behind. Anna Reyes's daughter is standing in a doorway, laughing in a photograph on my desk. That picture is worth more to me than any balance sheet. The fabric of a life is in the seams. You have to know which direction the threads run, or the whole thing pulls apart. I've always known. I just had to wait for the people around me to learn to look.